Hey, welcome back. Today we are looking at the American West in the post-Civil War era, so 1865 to the 1890s. Now, 1890 being a significant year because that year the American census declared that the frontiers no longer existed. The frontier defined as how many white people there are per acre. A few years later, Frederick Jackson Turner famously writes the significance of the frontier in American history and gives a talk on that in Chicago at the American Historical Association, where he says points out that we should be troubled by the closing of the frontier because it really was about the renewal of the American spirit, the renewal of American individualism, and American democracy. All that he places on the fact of open land to the west and the frontier experience. A troubling sign. In any case, this is the period we're looking at, and traditionally it's been presented by historians back in the day as the winning of the West, as if it was some kind of heroic and courageous battle on the part of the settler against all odds. Which, in some cases, yes, it was. We shouldn't take away from that. But of course, from an indigenous perspective, it's not even the West. It's an invasion from all sides. And more fundamentally, from that perspective, it is an out-and-out genocide. And that perspective starts to challenge the old narrative by the 1970s. And that happens with the social history turn. It also comes about with the rise of the American Indian movement, and some landmark books on this come out at that time. One of them, which I encourage you to look at, is Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee by D. Brown. There's also the occupation of the Custer battlefield in the 1970s, again, part of the American Indian movement thing. But yeah, from their side, it is more the story of a haphazard, unplanned genocide. The American Indian Wars, the massacres. Now that kind of stuff will dominate today in any textbook on the period, including your own. I also teach a course in the American West, and here's a plug for that. If you want the indigenous history, if you want everything, the Mountain Man era, the Mark Twains, the California Gold Rush, the full meal deal, even the crazy Mormons. Okay. In this lecture, though, my goal is what you see over here in this slide. Okay. And we're looking at the reality of the West for those who did heed this siren call to go there. And that's the American men and women, white and black. And we're looking squarely at the dominant trope of the mythic West, which is this place of violence, of lawmen and gunfighters, cattle rustlers, vigilante justice. And we're trying to separate myth from reality. And in that, the argument is that I'm making, as per Richard Maxwell Brown's work, that there's a structure to this violence that was often missed. And ironically, as it turns out, in spite of the image of individual freedom and opportunity, the West, in really profound ways, is the one region of the United States where the individual really doesn't have much of a chance, at least not in this romantic era of the late 19th century bonanza years, the open range cowboy era, the gold rush era, the old West of so many books and Hollywood movies. And yet, the idea of the West as this epic place of hope and promise, that's a really important theme nonetheless. And one thing I try and get across in any course is that ideas matter. And probably no idea matters more in the American personality than the idea of the cowboy in the white hat in the West. This is where Americans set their stories. Super important. And that idea of the lawman or the cowboy in the white hat shooting down the forces of disorder. Super important myth. And you can see that in the fact that most of America's presidents, styled themselves as this kind of straight shooting cowboy, or they get their political bona fides in the Western experience. Literally in the frontier Indian Wars in the early days, or the other wars in the West, and that included even Lincoln, Pierce, Zach Taylor, Ulysses Grant, Harrison, Later, when those wars are over, by the 20th century, Teddy Roosevelt famously invents himself as a cowboy, reinvents himself as a cowboy in the Dakotas, comes back to the city and says his ranching experience took the sissy out of him. And that's where he gets his political creds, and launches his presidency with his famous invasion of Cuba with a bunch of Texas cowboys. He also appointed a bunch of Western gunfighters in his administration. Eisenhower, the boy from Abilene, he idolized the Abilene gunfighters of his hometown, Wild Bill Hickok and Tom Smith. Ronald Reagan gets his creds as a Hollywood cowboy. Lyndon B. Johnson, Bush were out and out Texas cowboys. And this matters. This really matters. If the chief executive sees America as an extension of the Old West, if that's their worldview, they will treat the world like that, like an extension of the OK Corral. Okay? And for better or worse, mostly for worse, and a lot of American foreign policy disasters come down to this very thing, this way of seeing the world, this cowboy worldview in the Oval Office. The code of the Western gunfighter. And that also directly applies to contemporary Second Amendment rights. The NRA likes to say the West wasn't won with a registered gun, which, a great bumper sticker, but as it turns out, they're pretty much wrong. Gun control was a big theme in that time and place, which we'll look at. Okay, enough said. I sold you on this topic. Let's saddle up and get going. All right, here we go. First thing, before we get into the history, here's another plug I want to give you, which is to get the most, to maximize your experience of this topic. You're going to want to watch or read some of the classics in American West, and one I really recommend is the Clint Eastwood movie Unforgiven. I use it both in my film course and my American West course. Why? Because it's a really good one. You'll enjoy it. Also, it plays with the theme of the individual Western hero, the gunfighter turned homesteader, and how that plays out in the Wyoming Territory of the 1880s. So Unforgiven also hints at the fact that the violence here is not random, and that's why I really like it, that there's a structure to it. If you do watch it, pay close attention to the names of the central characters, because there's a message hidden in there. If you have more time, read Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. And if you have more time than that, watch the Ken Burns miniseries, The West, which is really quite excellent. And then there's, I wanted to introduce you some of the bigger names of revisionist historians of the American West. And that would be Patricia Limerick, Richard White, Donald Worcester, and William Cronin. These are some of the big names. And it's an interesting field. It's a subfield of American history. The American History Association has its own subcategory called the Western History Association, and it has its own conferences every year, which are really fun to attend. And it's a fairly tight, small coterie of big names in that field, which you get to know pretty fast if you do a deep dive into this area, and if you end up doing an essay on it. Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, there's that title right there by D. Brown, and Richard White's great textbook, It's Your Misfortune, None of My Own, although it's getting a bit dated now, is one to read. And Assassination of Jesse James, a good example of another great movie which I really enjoyed. Both Unforgiven and that one are made in Alberta, by the way, which is often happens. And then American Primeval, which came out a while ago, and really gets at the brutal violence in the American West in ways that Cormac McCarthy does as well, and gives us the Mormons, which is unusual. The Mountain Meadows Massacre, it completely botches it, and which films are prone to do. This is a mini-series, actually. But in any case, there's a plug for you. Okay, Fenema, calm down. Let's get into it, and yeah, and let's recall what the American West was supposed to be. Okay? And we know this from where we got to in the course so far, the Jeffersonian vision, right? The big hope, the free soil West, and of which the Civil War was fought, right? Beginning in the 1830s, already the American West became more than a region, became this place of promise, this hope, and the Jeffersonian vision that it's the best insurance to secure democracy itself. This dispersal of land to the daily multiplying millions is what it would happen, right? To the yearly multiplying millions, and that's the whole promise of manifest destiny. And this is embodied better than anything else in this amazing painting you often see by John Gast. It's called American Progress. And here we have Lady Columbia, the personification of America, heading into the West. And she's brilliant, and her brilliance is making the darkness flee from her, the darkness including the savage tribes. And she's bringing civilization. Now, kind of awkwardly, she has this school book under her arm. That's not a super subtle message about the bringing of education, and she's stringing this telegraph line in her left hand, and look at how these uncivilized Western tribes are fleeing from her into the darkness. Not sure where to. That's not super clear, but she's not looking at them. She's on a mission, and she's that mission is clear by the star of destiny on her forehead. Or she has destiny on her side, and that's what that star represents. Just to be 100% clear here. So yeah, John Gass, not super subtle. No, I wouldn't say it's a great painting, but it speaks to this moment in time, this uber confidence in the opening of the West, and the symbolic centerpiece of this during the Civil War is the Homestead Act, which is this amazing endpoint of a whole lot of federal policies, federal land policies that go back to Thomas Jefferson. Actually, before Thomas Jefferson, the idea of the Federalists in the Washington era was to make land artificially expensive because you wanted the laboring poor to stick around and work in your mines, mills, and factories in the era of mercantilism. The Federalists had a very different vision for America. Thomas Jefferson blew that open with the Louisiana Purchase and his vision that the West was a safety valve and you should open it up to as many as possible and make land affordable. And free soil. Free soil, the idea of the West as a safety valve. A Jeffersonian vision is of a wide property owning electorate. And now it can finally come to pass. In the context of the Civil War, Lincoln's administration passes two significant laws that they only can pass without trouble because the South has seceded. And one is the Railroad Act, which is the framework for building a transcontinental, and there have been debates between North and South of how that would run, but now those debates are over. And in the context of the Civil War, obviously, and the Homestead Act for giving Western lands to any American person, by the way, male or female, 21 or older. And that's 160 acres each. And you get that simply with a small filing fee and the proviso that you're improving these lands to the point that you're still there 5 years later. So yeah, that's the Jeffersonian free soil promise, the idea that Republican liberty is best safeguarded by a wide property owning electorate, a nation of small farmers. And with that too, this notion that agriculture is the highest end use of the land. And that's the thing. So whether it's the timber country of the Northwest or the desert country of the Intermountain West, it's surveyed into these small homesteads for disposal to these millions of eager settlers, and to create this great agricultural empire, right? This great free soil empire of independent individual farmers. Now the thing is, men might have their ideas, but Mother Nature has her own ideas, and this Northern Republican vision, the Homestead Act, has very limited success west of the 100th meridian. Has success east of that, and that's because that's the dividing line really between areas of America that get more or less than 22 inches of rainfall per year. Which is the point at which you need irrigation if there's less than that. So much of the American West is not suited to agriculture, the unfortunate fact, and most of it ends up returning into the public domain. And much heartache and failure, and a lot of the violence in the American West happens because of this basic environmental fact and the failure of Congress to recognize it. It is not till 1934 that we have the Tailored Grazing Act, which is this long overdue framework for using the semi-arid lands for what they actually can support. Now, in the Canadian West, there was a Grazing Act in the 1880s already, where it was recognized that much of this land was unsuited for agriculture, therefore it should be set up for grazing, but not so in the United States, not till 1934. And you can, that is really the best way to understand that, is because of the power of that Jeffersonian ideal that Congress does not want to give up on. The same thing happens with the timberlands in the West. You have to do an end run around the Homestead Act and create, which is you have to all sorts of fraud happens in the timberlands in order to harvest these forests, because they're meant to be carved up into 160-acre lots. Well, imagine a settler going out into an old-growth forest here in the Northwest and what that would look like. It simply doesn't work. So, yeah, and in terms of this great Republican experiment of resettling the surplus population, the Jeffersonian vision was anti-urban. This doesn't happen either. So between 1865 and 1892, I'll give you stats on that. 2 million people settled in the American West as per the Homestead Act. They take up 400,000 farms. That sounds impressive, but only 1/3 of them, 1 out of 3 of them, prove up their claims. So only 1/3 of them are there 5 years later. But the bigger number is, and the bigger context is that in this same time period, 32 million new immigrants arrived to America. So it is not draining this excess population. It is not this great experiment in that at all. Mostly it is a fail. Okay? And another point there to make, and less important one, is that the typical homesteader doesn't get it through the Homestead Act, this romantic ideal of the securing it directly from Congress. A lot of them, more of them, get it through these railroad massive land grants. The railroads are given a huge swath of America, over 200 million acres, which is a quid pro quo for building these without Congress having to pay for them. So it's that's the idea. They get this free land, and then they can pay for their construction costs through the disposal of that land to settlers. So many settlers get, that's often the best land because it's next to the railroad. Obviously, it's a way to get your produce to market. So this is how many settlers get it. That's about 10% of the USA is given away in this time, 10% of the land base. And state lands are also, Congress also gives land to the states, and they dispose of that to settlers. And then speculators end up getting quite a bit of this land, and settlers buy it through middlemen. But yeah, most of this land ends up back in the public domain, as you can see in these maps here, right? This shows you the failure of the disposal of public lands by the Bureau of Land Management and percentage of federal-owned acreage by state. You can see Nevada, it's over 90%. And this makes sense. And it's not like Congress hadn't been warned. So John Wesley Powell, who famously had explored in the West and had first to raft down the Colorado River, really the only substantial river in the American West, said that 2% of this region, the Intermountain West, was suitable for agriculture. Congress doesn't want to believe that because too much depends on that. So all these theories come up to hopeful, optimistic theories of how we can make this land work. One of them is, and maybe you've heard of that, rain follows the plow theory, that when you break up the soil, the rain will come. There were other zany ideas. One of them was the Timber Culture Act of 1873, which reflected the idea, or this is an act that reflects an idea, that if you plant trees, the rain will come, which of course, if you plant trees in the desert, they die. But in any case, 50 extra acres for you if you plant 10 of them in timber and promptly watch those trees wither away. And now you have extra acreage, which is exactly how it had been when you showed up. But in any case, it takes many acres to field one cow in much of this area. This was bison country, right? It's an ecological vacuum that's been created by the disappearance of the buffalo, but there's only so many that you can range, especially if you enclose, right? The buffalo are moving around. If you a set amount of acreage and you fence it off, this is going to be a disaster. Okay, so it simply doesn't work, and the Spanish had understood that, and they had doled out land grants to villages themselves. So a town like Santa Fe, they would have this communal grazing land around the town itself, and everyone would have their own little plots in the village. That was a Spanish way of doing things. They also had a different approach to water, to legal rights to water. The Mormons also set a different example that Congress might have paid heed to, which is how they dealt with water rights, and how they also made the desert bloom through a communal, cooperative, basically communist system, which of course is not in the cards. But in any case, the Congress doesn't give up on this vision. As I said, not until 1934 with the Taylor Grazing Act, and not till the early 20th century in the Pacific Northwest with the different forestry acts that happened, where timberlands are finally opened up in ways that they actually can work economically. But still, into the 20th century, well into the 20th century, the feds invest billions and billions to underwrite this Jeffersonian vision of the individual small-scale farmer on individual plots in the West. And that's through mostly through three agencies: the Bureau of Land Management, the Bureau of Reclamation, which is an interesting name itself. Reclamation, the idea that they are reclaiming lands when in fact they always had been arid, and the U.S. Forest Service. Again, the Bureau of Reclamation, and perhaps you know this, was the agency through which these great dams in the West were built in order to supply both power and irrigation to small farmers. So the Grand Coulee Dam and the Hoover Dam being two of the most famous. The Central Arizona Project, all of that is through the Bureau of Reclamation, taking the Colorado River and distributing it among the western states. Now, as I said before, the failure of the Homestead Act really explains a lot. And one thing that explains is the level of violence in the American West at this time, but also the structure to it. So we see that in the range wars, which I'll get to in a minute. But really another very important point of context is that this in some ways is bound to be a violent period anyways. And that should be fairly obvious, that given that we have a generation of Civil War survivors who are very acquainted with violence, and many of whom have been given free rein to act on that for years, and who have no compunction whatever in using their weapons. So think of it that way. This is a generation of combatants who have what we would today call PTSD. And that becomes clear when you consider the basic facts about the Civil War that I already gave you, which, 750,000 killed in this amazing crucible of violence with over 10,000 engagements. Consider, too, that one thing I didn't get into is that much of this fighting is by voluntary militias. And in fact, these voluntary militias are what form the core of both the Confederate and Union armies. These are very unlike the armies of today. These are community organized, and in some states in particular, they're fighting to protect their homes and their families in a context that we would call ethnic cleansing. And certainly you see that in states like Missouri, which has divided loyalties, and where both union and pro and anti-slavery, and Kansas as well, and where you see 1,200 skirmishes in Missouri alone. Many of those are involving what are called bushwhackers. Now, these are volunteers in militias who use guerrilla warfare tactics, and pretty brutal ones. A few big names here. Bloody Bill Anderson is a good example. Jesse James fought in his unit. One of their more notorious raids was in Centralia. They ambush and murder a couple dozen unarmed Union troops in a train, and then that's followed by a battle where they kill 140 more. But what's even more disturbing is after that they then decapitate, mutilate them, they scalp them, and they've tortured some of them to death. William Quantrill is another name. His raiders, Quantrill's raiders, kill about almost 200 men and boys in Lawrence, Kansas, which was a pro or anti-slavery capital in Kansas. Both Jesse and Frank James fought with Quantrill. So whether it's pro-slavery men such as those with Bill Anderson or free soil guerrilla bands, this is very ugly, very personal. It's plundering homesteads, it's raiding of towns and neighbors, murdering their neighbors, right? And it's a really long affair. I consider a band like Terry's Texas Rangers. Texas Rangers, this one band of them, Terry's Texas Rangers, go all over the place. They fight in hundreds of small skirmishes before the war is over. And that's really important to how the war ends, so right? So no surprise that at the end there are many professional gunfighters. But also consider this: when it's over, the Confederate guerrillas, like the James brothers, they're supposed to take themselves you have a choice. You either give up or you keep fighting, right? And giving up means you have to surrender to a Union depot, often in the capital, state capital, and surrender your arms and take a loyalty oath. Now that is a very tough pill to swallow, and many of them simply can't do that, especially after this very personal, multi-year war which the brutality level I just described. In any case, these men will populate these vigilante gangs that keep fighting on in the West. And they fall into those lines, a lot of these gangs of Confederate or Republican. Now, some of them fight as social bandits. Some of them are in it for themselves, and some of them are becoming hired guns who will work for whoever pays them. Many, like the Earp brothers, are becoming lawmen in this period. Now, the first place that these professional gunfighters gain employment and gain commissions is in these cattle towns. And the Kansas cattle towns in themselves are an interesting thing. The first one is Abilene. It's set up by a guy named Joseph McCoy, who's only 20-something. And it's simply a place where drovers and buyers can meet. And in the wider context, what happens during the Civil War is the Texas Longhorns multiply, having been neglected because of the war, and there's about 6 million of them at the end of the war, ranging around. Now, cattle are selling for only about $3 in Texas, but you can get $60 for them in Chicago, $90 for them in New York if you can get them to market. And these railroads are expanding across the plains, and the Kansas cattle towns are these moving towns that, beginning with Abilene and Dodge City, Hayworth, Ellsworth, on down the line, as the railroads expand and these cattle trails come out of Texas to meet to get to the railheads there and where the sales are done. And this is the genesis of the cowboys, who's essentially this pretty prosaic story of several thousand men, about 30,000 of them, taking millions of cattle and driving them both to these railheads, but also to these expanding ranches in the American West. Now, the disappearance of the buffalo, of course, has made this ecological vacuum that can be filled with cattle as long as you don't fence them in, which unfortunately is done. But in any case, this is where some of these professional gunfighters begin their careers after the war, and they tend to land better. Now, the Earps are a great example of that. There's a picture of the Dodge City Peace Commission. It's got Wyatt Earp in there. The famous gunfighter Bill Masterton is there as well. Google or a PowerPoint helpfully gave me a title for Wyatt Earp there as a person with a mustache and a hat. I thought I'd keep that there. But that's Wyatt Earp, who gets his first commission in Abilene and then goes on to other towns. He tends to get fired for murdering the wrong people, including his own deputy at one point. But yeah, this is where these gunfighters, many of these gunfighters, get their work. Now, one of the really interesting things about these Kansas cattle towns is that the death count, the body count, was quite low. And there's a famous article by Ken Dykstra, a Western historian, who it's called "Overdosing on Dodge City," right? Because so much fiction, so much Hollywood film has been done on the famous cattle towns, right? Dodge City and all the rest. And he says the body count was fairly low, and actually that is true, at least in one measure. But the reason it is because of pretty strict gun control by these professional gunfighters, okay? And not as low as Dykstra makes it sound, though. But in any case, it depends on your methodology, how you come up with numbers with FBI methodology of today, then yeah, it is shockingly high, but these are very small towns. So if you have a town of 2 and one person kills the others, there's 50% homicide rate. Anyway, enough said there. Look into it if you're interested. But yeah, overall, these gunfighters managed to keep the peace, and that was really important for the business community in these towns, because they don't want a bunch of yahoos shooting up the place, and it's not great for business, right? Simple as that. Right? Now, in mining towns, that's even more important, because in mining towns like Tombstone, Arizona, and that's where the Earp brothers will end up, you really count on outside investors, and there's thousands of ghost towns in the Old West, and the reason there are is because it costs a lot. The surface diggings are easy to get at, gold and silver, but it's the lower ones that you need deep shafts for, that where the bigger loads are, requires outside investment, requires a whole lot of capital. And if your town seems to be run by a bunch of rowdies, and there's no control whatsoever, then outside investors notoriously cautious to park their money where that happens, and so gun control and order really matters. But yes, that gets back to my point that the National Rifle Association, the NRA, and anyone passionate about their Second Amendment right to bear arms is wrong in thinking that guns were never regulated. Here in the Old West, of all places, at least in the famous cattle towns like Dodge City and Abilene, they definitely were. But violence was much more endemic on the cattle ranges, the new cattle ranges of the West. Now, partly because most Western fiction, whether film or book, it doesn't question the myth of the individual winning the West. In fact, that's the dominant narrative. They also tend to get the violence wrong. And what they miss is that there is a structure to it. And what we have here, and what is known as the territorial era, the era before most of these territories are states. So you have, Wyoming territory, you've got the Dakota territories, you've got Oregon Territory, which later becomes Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. So the territorial era basically is kind of like a second Civil War, and it's not an even fight at all. On the winning side, on the power side, you have the Northern Republican interests, who have all the might of the Gilded Age industry behind them and all the capital, and they quickly dominate the territorial governments. And in fact, they effectively generally control the politicians here through what are called the territorial rings. Okay? So akin to like the kind of corruption you'll see in New York City with the Tammany Hall ring, like a political ring like that is the terminology of the day, the territorial rings. So it's politicians and investor class. And they're working. The politicians out here are working in the interests of those Eastern investors, who then are using their very considerable resources to take control and effectively shut out all other comers, right? And in the cattle industry, that means the independent homesteaders and the independent cattle ranchers. Now, these folks are often Southern Democrats who, having the South having been bankrupted in the Civil War, they are a more desperate class of people heading west. A good example of how this works is the case of John Illiff in Colorado. There's the rest of my slide just populated. But anyway, he's a classic cattle baron, John Illiff. Now, because the only way to own the public domain is via the Homestead Act, what Illiff does is he gets his employees to file claims on 120 separate homesteads, each of which has water access. And the reason is because when you control the water, you effectively have control over the entire surrounding area. Now, this is fraud. Clearly, you cannot get your employees to file claims and then transfer them to you, but that's what he does. But even more so is what these cattle barons also do, and this is that men like Illiff will use the newly invented barbed wire, invented believe 1872, to look it up, to fence off their watering holes, and to fence off the public grazing areas around. This is completely illegal, and it is what leads to these famous fence cutting wars throughout much of the West, including Texas. It happens there, it happens in New Mexico, it happens in Wyoming, it happens in Montana. Good example of a range war like that is the Johnson County War in Wyoming. What happens here is the cattle barons have their own organization, the WSGA, the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. And their main deal is getting in, of course, on the beef bonanza. And the beef bonanza is massive, huge returns on your investment of up to 80% in 1 year, at least in the early days of the cattle boom. And in order to get in on that, because it's so lucrative, they really want to shut out all contenders. Now, the most powerful person in Wyoming is not the governor, it's Thomas Sturgis, head of the WSGA, who's in tight with the governor, and the WSGA also controls the only bank in the territory, the Stock Growers Bank. And basically, he can make or break you, as can the WSGA. Now, Stock Growers Association under Sturgis, they do a few things. One is they get the railroads to agree to only ship WSGA member cattle back east. So very difficult for small independent grazers to get their cattle to market. That's the first thing. Then they go to war against small-time ranchers in two other ways. And one is with mavericks. Now, the interesting thing about ranching is just how basic it is. I think that's a contradictory statement. Anyway, you set the cattle loose in the spring to calve and then to forage on the open range. And then you round them up in the fall for market. So yeah, let loose, forage, round up, repeat. But where the conflicts begin is over the new calves that are born in the spring breeding season. And that's what the topic of this amazing painting by Western artist Frederick Remington, what an unbranded cow has cost, because you get fights over who owns this calf, this maverick. So what the WSGA does is they pass a law that any mavericks, any unbranded calves are henceforth WSGA property. And also that only WSGA brands will be allowed in the territory. So it's illegal to run unbranded cattle, so the free grazers trying to work their homestead by legally making use of the open range are de facto rustlers. More so if they round up their own calves in the spring. Now things boil over, and when the Johnson County free grazers set up their own vigilante committee, they call themselves the regulators, and to defend themselves against what the cattle barons do, which is they hire 90 Texas gunfighters, professional gunfighters, to come up to Wyoming, and they give them a hit list of 70 names on it, and so they tell this posse, this is 1892, to head out and lynch them all. Before that, they've already lynched, the WSGA has already lynched Cattle Kate Watson and her partner for alleged cattle wrestling. Okay? And so in any case, the long and short of it, between these two vigilante groups, the regulators and these Texas, the invaders, the Texas gunfighters, we get the regulators actually ambush our Texans, and in one of these rare cases, the little guys are winning, and what we get is a 3-day shootout from that. The WSGA sends message all the way back to the White House that they need a rescue here, and the cavalry is sent in to rescue the Texans. So, but that's not the end of the story. And in fact, what happens after the dust settles in their famous rescue right from the Oval Office, or the cavalry, is the WSGA hires one gunfighter, Tom Horn. Now, he's a classic professional gunfighter in the Old West. He had been an Army scout during the Civil War, then became a Pinkerton Guard, and then he becomes this hired assassin by the WSGA. Hired gun to come up. They give him a hit list now of 90 names on it, and he is sent to kill them all. And he does. He starts out on his mission, goes through a bunch of names on the list, And it's only when he kills a 14-year-old boy that is seen as going too far, and he ends up being charged and pays the ultimate price for that. But that is the end of the Johnson County War, and at the end of the day, the WSGA did get control there. Any case, and this is the kind of thing that perpetuates itself all over the place. Montana Territory, we get the same thing. Stuart Stranglers, the War on the Rustlers, 1884. Lincoln County, New Mexico, we get the House versus the competition, and the House is connected to the Santa Fe ring. That's a territorial ring there, and these are politicians and speculators who run New Mexico. And they're getting all those land grants away from the natives and the Hispanics on the old Spanish grants. This Lincoln County War, one of the more famous, because this is where Billy the Kid and about 20 other professional gunfighters learn their craft in what becomes a 6 months range war after the street battle in downtown, if you can call it that, Lincoln. Of Lincoln County. Okay? The movie Young Guns is based on that one. Okay? So, and this is a classic story of resistor gunfighters coming up against the incorporators, who in this case in Lincoln County is not free range. The economy there is not, it is both sheep and cattle, but also mining. Okay, so this kind of thing happens in mining towns, and it happens in cattle towns. This is class violence between the incorporating side and the resistance side, and the resistors generally being Confederates from the South who have become impoverished by the Civil War, and they move west trying to make a claim for themselves, trying to make a stake for themselves. The incorporating forces tend to be Republicans from the North who are defending investors from back east. Okay, and that's the Civil War of incorporation. And one thing you might want to check out, this is kind of interesting, is the white hats, Agora Blancas, because there's also an ethnic component to what's happening here in this Civil War, and that's with these Hispanics that I talked about being defrauded out of what was supposed to be their by treaty their land rights when America defeats Mexico in war and annexes those massive territories, what today is Arizona, New Mexico, California. The deal was under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that the Spanish would be guaranteed their land rights. But as with the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, this isn't always the case. In fact, what happens in New Mexico is quite the opposite. So where the Anglos and some, it has to be said, rich Spaniards, Hispanics are defrauding the poorer Hispanics out of their land. And we get the white hats going up against the Santa Fe ring as well, which is another fence cutting war in the Old West. A great example of that too is Tombstone, Arizona. Here's where probably the most famous example is exactly what I'm talking about, where the Earp brothers are Republicans. They're from the North, and they come to Tombstone having served in various capacities of the law, especially Wyatt Earp, in other towns, and now they've landed in the new big silver strike out west, which is in Tombstone, Arizona, not far from the Mexican border. And here's where they get very invested in the local mine, as well as in local real estate. It's one of these boom towns, and it's the bonanza economy, which again goes against the expectation, and this is one of the points too, is that this bonanza economy is not what was hoped for at all, right? It was supposed to be an agricultural economy, but this is what it looks like. And so invest in real estate, but also get commissions, beginning with Wyatt and then his brothers. And become tavern owners, which also means that they're effectively pimps, because taverns have that. And with the big name that they have as gunfighters by this point, they do very, very well. Now, of course, then they have to have their enemies, which are in this case the cowboys, which are the Clantons and McClorys, who ride into town and create havoc. And the last thing you want when you have, and this is the key point, when you have a mining town like this, the last thing you want is disorder, because you want the big investors to come and invest, but you also want them to stay. And it's easy enough often in these towns to get the first diggings are easy in gold and silver, the placer mining. After that, you've got to go into the deep shafts, which are very, very expensive. Expensive investments. So what you want is the deep pockets from back east and increasingly also from San Francisco to come and invest in your town, and they're not going to be investing if they feel their money is unsafe, because it's a town of anarchy and lawlessness. So hence again, gun control and this divide between the forces of incorporation and the resistors, in this case the cowboys, and who the Earps do not appreciate, especially that they bring their guns into town. And it's exactly that is the pretext for the showdown at the OK Corral, the most famous shootout in American history, which takes all of 30 seconds and leaves a good number of those, as you see, the cowboys dead, which then leads to a trial and acquittal of the Earps. They're exonerated. They're seen as having done their duty, and that leads to a retaliation by associates of the clan, the McClory clan, who number actually about 200 of these cowboys, and they shoot and kill. Well, they shoot and injure Virgil, and then they kill Morgan, and that leads to the famous Earp vendetta ride, where the Earps and their associates go out after the cowboys and chase them all over Arizona. Frank Stillwell is shot in in Tucson. While trying to hide under a train, and there's a statue actually of Wyatt Earp there in Tucson, right at the train station, which is fascinating. In any case, and it's analogous to what we get with Clint Eastwood in Whiskey Gap, where he goes on his own vendetta ride. So this kind of thing absolutely is this reality that we have here in the Old West, that it is these incorporating and resistance gunfighters. And they don't always break down neatly into these two sides, but this is definitely what it's like. And definitely, as I said, the Civil War had been this breeding ground for these gunfighters of the West, and now we have another Civil War being fought out in this bonanza economy that's taking place in this time period. So yeah, fun times, rich period, and I just want to draw your attention to this book here by Frederick Allen. It's called A Decent Orderly Lynching. Great title for a great book. And what he does is he does a deep dive into what happened in Montana. Now Montana, much like Wyoming, there's a stock growers association there that's led by a cattle baron named Granville Stewart. They come up with a hit list of the free grazers they don't like, about 90 of them. I believe they killed about 20 before they dealt with their problem. That wasn't the first vigilante group in Montana. The first was before that, which was legitimately dealing with these, the Henry Plummer gang, and he was a corrupt mayor in the goldfields whose road bandit crew was stealing from miners and killing them. So, but like all these things, they get out of hand. But they establish a peace on the frontier, absent an established judicial system. And because Montana begins during the Civil War, the gold strike there in the gold fields there, that all takes off during the Civil War. There is no federal judge here for a while. So this is how that takes hold. So Pax Vigilanticus, great term for this vigilante peace that is established in what we call the Old West. Now Richard White, he calls it an ideology of vigilantism, and as a revisionist historian, he's not one to exaggerate body counts and all the rest of it, but he says that there were, by his estimation, there were 200 vigilante organizations operating in the Old West from 1865 to 1893. We also know that there were, we don't know their body count because obviously they didn't advertise. We also know that we know of at least 300 names of gunfighters that we would call resistance gunfighters, and there was probably many thousands more. Now, what's interesting how this reverberates through to today, that this sense that this was okay, this vigilante justice. I think of that Willie Nelson song, Whiskey for My Men, Beer for My Horses. It's a great example of that celebrated vigilantism. Just get out there and string them up, and it's almost it's a type of fascism, really, is what that celebrates. But Montana Highway Patrol to this day has this on their badges, 3777, which was the calling card that was left by the vigilante organization there in the goldfields. They would leave that on the bodies of their victims. Wilbur Sanders was a prosecutor for Montana vigilantes in what we would call kangaroo court trials, and who became a senator. And is whitewashed through history, and there he is proudly in the Montana State Capitol, along with this I couldn't help myself. I had to throw up that dorky mural, which is also in the Montana State Capitol, because it reminded me so much of Parks and Rec. And just this disconnect between, the school kids that come through and are told the whitewash history. They're not told about the lynchings and all that side of it. Any case, hope you enjoyed that part of the lecture. And now we're going to get into another side of this period in the American West, which is focusing on race. Okay, and as we get into the discussion on race here in what we call the Old West, I just want to start by pointing out that when I was young, a long time ago, you would wake up on weekends, on Saturday mornings, you turn on the TV, and these long black and white, of course, long black and white movies, Western movies, every Saturday morning. Super long, super poorly done, and one thing about them is they did not have a single black face in the cast. So my generation grew up thinking that was normal, that what we thought of as the Old West did not have African Americans in it. And of course, we couldn't have been more than wrong. As it turns out, 25% of the cowboys in those cattle drives I talked about, those 30,000 cowboys that are taking these cattle up to the railheads and to the northern ranches, were African Americans. And it makes sense that they're in the West, because whereas in as much as the West is fraught if you're a white Confederate, excuse me, for African Americans, it really is an opportunity. It really is an opportunity to reinvent yourself, and much more so than the North, where Jim Crow is coming back in a big way in northern cities as African Americans go there, and definitely more than going to Africa, which is always a problem with the colonization society. So, and in fact, there were some very famous African Americans as well in the Old West. And Ned Huddleston is a great example of that. He changes his name later to Isom Dart when he tries to go straight. He was a slave, emancipated during the war, and then counterintuitively, he ends up helping the Confederacy as a scout. Then he heads west, and he ends up in the Arizona border region, rustling cattle from across the border and selling them into the States. So he's kind of what the Earp brothers are up against in that area. He becomes a prospector and a gang member. Tries to go straight later and ends up homesteading in this really cool canyon that exists between Colorado and Wyoming called Brown's Hole. So here but then he makes the decision to take up with this Ann Bassett, who happens to be a wrestler who is connected to Butch Cassidy's Table Rock Gang. So because she has this history, she ends up on a hit list in one of these classic range wars. This is the Browns Park Range War, and it's actually Range Detective Tom Horn who's been hired here, and he ends up killing Ned Huddleston when he doesn't vacate his homestead. Nat Love is another one, famous African American in this time we call the Old West, and he claims, and there's some pretty good evidence, that he is the inspiration for Deadwood Dick, or he claimed he was, but there were several others that made that claim as well. There's a lot of evidence around him being the original Deadwood Dick. He, which is a pulp fiction series, a classic Old West classic pulp fiction series. And it lines up well. He was a slave. He headed west. He hooked up with Billy the Kid once and some other famous gunfighters. He ends up in a gang. He's captured at one point by the Pima Indians for the tribe for a time. Later on becomes a rodeo star. He's definitely a sharpshooter, known for that. And yeah, whether he's the inspiration for Deadwood Dick, not super clear, but the evidence is there. Either way, in the Deadwood Dick series, he is whitewashed. So, like everything else, like the films and fictions film and fiction that comes out of the American West, the African American is whitened for the white audience. But yeah, to the extent that that a film or a book includes African American characters, it gets it right. And then again, if you do watch Unforgiven, then you'll see Morgan Freeman. And yeah, accurate. Okay, another facet of the African American experience in the West is that many thousands of them end up in Kansas. Kansas is seen as, through colonization societies, these are called exodusters, not only in Kansas but mainly there, largely because African Americans associated with the land of John Brown, where these famous abolitionists gave their lives. John Brown of the attempted slave rebellion gave his life for the cause of freedom. And so that's where they want to be, and that's where they head. They do that in immigrant societies and in group masses, so entire groups will move over and establish new towns on the plains, and they do that for self-protection, and largely it's the transit to the west that is the dicey part of that, because there are armed gangs along the Mississippi that are capturing you and sending you back. In fact, even doing things such as cutting the hands off of freedmen who are trying to get out of the South and head west, as a message to those back on the former plantations that, hey, if you want to leave the South and go work in the West, try to do that without your hands. So terrible stuff. And Congressional Committee investigated that. We know quite a bit of the details of this kind of thing. So in any case, the exodusters, another important point. Now, invariably, most of these who tried farming, the African Americans, freedmen who tried farming, gave it up and moved to the cities, the capital cities in Kansas, Topeka, or places like Denver or California. And the explanation for that is that stoop and pick agriculture of cotton picking, is labor intensive, but is not technical in the least. So they are not really trained for the full-on farm experience. And then added to that is the difficulties of farming in marginal Western lands anyway, which we've already talked about. So yeah, most of these communities no longer exist anymore except for in name, but they're definitely part of the story of the American West, and one of those places where yeah, there was opportunity in also, as they moved to cities, in retail, in which is something that Asians are taking up as well, as you know. As you probably do know, as are women. Women find a lot of freedom in the American West in general. You can see that empirically. In fact, it's all the big firsts happen out west. Wyoming is the first territory to give women the right to vote, 1869. Utah is shortly after that. It's also the first state, Wyoming, to enter into the Union with women's suffrage in its constitution. Other western states, territories followed that. Utah, Colorado, Idaho, Washington, California, Oregon, Arizona, all before the 19th Amendment is ratified in 1920, they give women the vote. So suffrage, it's a revolution there compared to what's happening back east. First woman to Congress is Jeanette Rankin from Montana, 1916. First female governor is from Wyoming in the mid-1920s. So why is this happening? Well, pretty clear that there's a unique social and political landscape here. And I mentioned that before, that women could and did file homestead claims. So given this massive opportunity, which is unparalleled for the time, that's already a significant thing. And 10% of those who filed claims were women. Now, we know that that's not always a path to success, 100% not. But often women would inherit homesteads when their partners died, or their businesses, which is what you would prefer. Yeah, and of course their partners died fairly regularly. And as you know from Seth MacFarlane, if maybe that movie dates me, but there are a million ways to die in the West. Yeah, but you don't want a homestead usually unless it's a successful ranch, and but women are left those as well. Well-off women from Europe, from the East, could be on the Republican side of that war of incorporation. They could be running ranches that their wealthy husbands leave them. That did happen. Yeah, and a lot of women start their own businesses also. There's a more progressive climate politically here, which gets to the fact that the old rules don't matter here. And that's a really important point that I want to park on a minute. And I'll give you a quote here from Richard White. Yeah, because the West doesn't replicate the agricultural middle class communities of back east, what we have are these disproportionately male societies where most men see themselves as temporary residents. They're not stickers in the terminology of the day. They're here to get rich and they go back. So that means they also tolerate a kind of a half world that they wouldn't tolerate back east. Because that's what the idea is. They expect that they're here temporarily and they will re-enter regular society later. So for now, it's a story of compromise, of rootlessness, along with this gender imbalance, and also this shared goal everyone has that they all understand and respect of making money. And great quote from Richard White there, that the West was a libertarian's dream world in a society that existed only to create wealth. Government served only to secure and protect property. And women were not a threat to that. And so you get some really amazing stories. For example, in Denver, this ex-slave, Claire Brown, she heads out west and starts a laundry. Then she starts investing in mining and in real estate, and she makes a fortune and becomes a major benefactor. Maddie Silks, also Denver, becomes a prominent madam there, a brothel owner. She leverages that into a business empire. In Tombstone, Arizona, we've got a Mrs. Lum, who's also known as China Mary, which is actually a more common name given to Chinese women in the West. But she ran a general store, and then she branched out into gambling houses. She owned brothels and opium dens. With that too, the center of most communities is not the church as it is back east, it's the tavern. Usually a faro tavern, it's not poker. Faro is a preferred game, and there's a fixed, it's interesting because the shuffler, the mechanical shuffler is fixed for the house. Everybody knows it, but they play anyway. Don't need to go there, but the Faro Tavern usually has soiled doves working the upstairs rooms. If you want more on this, Ann Butler, historian Ann Butler, for a long time was the only one doing work on this. She wrote a really important book. Her seminal book was Daughters of Joy, Sisters of Mercy, Prostitution in the American West. But yeah, by her count and others, 50,000 prostitutes in the American West in the late 19th century. Now, partly what feeds into this is not just this rootlessness and this respect everyone has that government stay out of your hands unless all it needs to do is protect money, and that's all anyone is interested in and will tolerate. And tolerating this kind of half world, as I said, but also the Victorian myth of the passionless woman feeds into the just the staggering numbers of prostitutes in the American West, how normalized that was and how common that was for women to do even as part-time work. And maybe you've not heard of this, but the idea in the Victorian era is that women do not enjoy sex, and those who do, they are deviant in some way. And this rationalizes prostitution because from what men can tell, when they pay for sex, these women are enjoying it. Now, of course, that is the job of the prostitute to make it look like they are. So, but this defines them as deviant anyway. So it rationalizes one's use of them that way. So kind of an interesting sociological take on that. But yeah, one of the interesting things is when you study the American West, when you even get into it just Cole's Notes light, you're struck by how often prostitution comes into it and how often it comes up. And you see that all over the place. Here's Wild Bill Hickok's partner later in life was Calamity Jane. Maybe you've heard of her before, and perhaps you don't know much about her, but she was a sharpshooter in Deadwood, South Dakota, and a part-time prostitute. Doc Holliday, there's another name you probably heard. He a gambler and gunfighter who always promised to give up gambling, married to, or not married, common law with Kate Elder, known as Big Nose Kate. She always promised to give up prostitution. Neither of them did. Doc Holliday ends up in Tombstone, Arizona. That's where he dies. Some prostitutes do very, very well, especially in the early years. Pearl de Verre is one example of that. Pearl de Verre, 1893, she is charging $250 a night in Cripple Creek, Colorado. So that's about, it's really tough to do calculations on what money then is worth today, but it's over $5,000. Other examples, Chicago Joe in Helena, Montana. She got very, very wealthy, becomes the biggest landowner in the district. She owns most of the Main Street eventually, starting with some brothels. She opens this dance hall called the Red Light Saloon, and she's a pillar of the community. When yeah, and you can see here this notice that's put that we get from the paper in Helena, Montana, from her time period, where she's giving notice to liquor dealers not to give her husband any more credit because he's while she's out there making all the money, he's basically destroying their retirement plans. Any case, it's interesting, and yeah, just how endemic it was, and how successful these women could do in what is called the Madame era. And prostitution is an easy choice in this society, especially if you're abandoned, you're widowed, or you're divorced, and if you have children to support. Now, this independence, though, that I'm describing here changes after the 1880s. The era of the successful Madame is pretty short, and we know that by the 1890s, mostly it's men now that own the brothels. They are the pimps, and women are treated increasingly as property. And we also know that a fair number of them die in pretty brutal ways. A large percentage from venereal diseases, botched abortions, suicide, or in the case of Julie Billette, killed by their clients. Now, it needs saying too that for a very large percentage of prostitutes, it's an experience of out and out slavery. They are trafficked. And certainly that is very true of the Chinese prostitutes, especially in California, who are trafficked right out of China into San Francisco and other red light districts, the original being San Francisco, other red light districts around the West. That's also true of Native American women. They can be trafficked, but a lot of them also have quite a bit of agency, and that's important to know as well. What happens, though, in the case of both Chinese and Native American women is because some of them choose prostitution and some of them are forced into it, men tend to treat all of those racial groups as prostitutes. Women in those groups that are in urban centers are called crones or prostitutes and treated that way in general. And that obviates any kind of guilt men would feel in treating them all that way. There's been work done on that by Jean Barman, right, actually here in Victoria, where the Native women in Victoria, BC, during the Gold Rush time, they worked the dance halls, and some of them were prostitutes out of their own volition. And yeah, but all Indigenous women were characterized that way by men at the time. It's interesting stuff. Okay, two more brief points I want to give before we close this lecture, which has gone quite a while, quite a long one. One is that the myth of the West is being made in real time as it's happening. This is why it's hard to distinguish truth from fiction with the American West, and why myth really matters, right? Because the history of the American West is one of myth, and that myth is constructed in real time. There are a few examples of that. One of the main really interesting ones is Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Now, Buffalo Bill's is not the only Wild West show. Well, Bill Hickok had tried to start one, in fact, in Niagara Falls, but the problem was anyone could stand on the cliff and watch the whole thing, so nobody would pay. But there were other examples of attempts to do this, because there's a massive appetite back east for what is happening out west before it's all done, and that's the sense, right? And in Europe, these Buffalo Bill's Wild West show traveled to Europe. Now, the really odd thing is that this is happening while the Indian Wars are still happening out west. I mean, Buffalo Bill's show begins in 1883. Geronimo was not captured till 1886, which is always seen as the end of the Apache Wars. It's actually not. But then the odd thing is he ends up acting in the show. And there's an image there on the right of Geronimo in the Cadillac that he bought himself for the money he's making as an entertainer. Sitting Bull, who has a very tragic story, Lakota chief, he too ends up in Buffalo Bill's show, and as did many warriors. And you can see there a picture of Buffalo Bill, the old mule skinner, with these warriors around him. So many famous warriors do end up acting out, reenacting what is still happening to tribes out in the West, which is a very hard thing to get your head around. And all this is happening before the Ghost Dance revival and this tragic Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890, which really is the end of the Indian Wars in the plains, but not even in the Southwest. The Apache Wars go on into the early 20th century, actually. So that's an important theme in the American West, is that the myth is being perpetuated in real time, and it's a really interesting aspect of it. Now, where you see this as well is in the dime novel phenomenon. And Europeans and North Americans are obsessed with dime novels of anything American West. And one of the more interesting stories of that is the story of Kit Carson. Now, Kit Carson was a mountain man, fur trader, and explorer who explored the Santa Fe Trail and was key in the mapping of the American West. Okay? And very, very famous by the time of the Civil War, and dies 3 years after it in 1868. And this is a true story about how he's coming down the Santa Fe Trail at one point, and he comes upon a party that had been heading to Santa Fe of white immigrants, and then there was a family in that party, propitiously named the Whites. The husband had been killed, as had others, and the wife, Mrs. White, and had been captured and taken by the Apaches north. So Kit Carson is already a famous mountain man, and he's a good guide and trapper, and he goes and he's also involved in many of the wars in the Southwest, Indian wars in the Southwest. Anyway, he heads up to rescue Mrs. White, and he gets there just a bit too late, or the Apaches see him, they kill Miss White, and they take off. He comes upon her body, and he finds on her person this novel. Kit Carson, the fighting trapper. Kit Carson to the rescue, the man who always gets his, always wins, right? So it's just a fascinating story, and Richard White tells it as well in his book, It's Your Misfortune, but it really encapsulates a lot about the American West being made in real time. So that's one interesting point I want to give you. And the other comes to you from the Richard Maxwell Brown reading about the duty to stand your ground. Sorry, I should have said the duty to retreat, and how that disappears, or how that is challenged in America because of the American West experience. And that too is, as I said, it's in the article by Brown, so we don't have to park on that too long. But this goes back to these famous showdown between Wild Bill Hickok and Dave Tutt, Springfield, Missouri. Dave Tutt's aim is off because his heart's been exploded by Wild Bill Hickok's quicker draw, and it's all over a woman, of course, and something about a watch that, anyway, it doesn't matter, but but a pocket watch that Dave Tutt owed Wild Bill. It doesn't matter. The point is, this goes to court. The jury is read because Wild Bill is charged with murder, which of course is normal for the time. This is towards the end of the Civil War, which is ironic in itself. Anyway, he's being held for murder, and this is the case that really makes him quite famous, because it's covered in Harper's Magazine, and he gets a lot of notoriety out of it. But famously, the jury decides they won't listen to the judge reading them all about their legal duty, the duty to retreat. Right, this British idea that goes way back in British common law, which is that you always have to try and get yourself out of a fight. If you are cornered, fine, you can fight back. Self-defense is always a slippery thing, but the idea is that you should try and get away from a fight and not use force, or definitely not lethal force against someone else, unless you know it's about to be used against you. That is a duty to retreat. Now, the jury won't hear any of that legalese, and they decide that Wild Bill did exactly what any American man should be able to do. And from that, we get other courts following suit, and that is really how the law works. You set a precedent, and then other decisions are based on that precedent. Most famously, it is vindicated by Justice Wendell Holmes, who's Chief Justice for about 150 years, a little less than that, but in any case, into the 20th century for a very long time, has a massive reputation. And he famously said that the duty to retreat was unsuited to both the American mindset and the age of firearms. He also gave us this great line from history: "A man is not born to run away, especially not an American man." And so we get that directly from the Old West. We get this, what really applies today, is this ideology of being able to stand your ground, right? And with that, we get all these stand your ground laws, these castle doctrines, these which we still have, which are still very relevant in the States to this day. Now, this slide shows the states that have a stand your ground, a castle law. And basically, it means that there's a much lower bar for proving that you acted in self-defense. In essence, that's what it is. But it rejects this whole idea of duty to retreat, particularly when it comes to your own property, when you're in your own house or in your own vehicle. And some very odd things have come out of that. And some the George Zimmerman case, Trayvon Martin, was about that. All he was armed with was a bag of Skittles. He is gunned down by Zimmerman, and that was in Florida. And he is vindicated from that. There's been all sorts of crazy cases that come out of the whole stand your ground and castle doctrine thing. Anyway, that's where we're ending it, and I hope this lecture gave you well, it gave you quite a bit, I know that much. So yeah, if you have any questions, 100% let me know, and take care. Thanks for listening.